everyone, and welcome to the second cloud debate for 2020. It's actually our second cloud debate for the year, but it's our first cloud debate during the COVID lockdown and during the COVID pandemic. So we're doing things slightly differently tonight, and I know that you as an audience, if you've been with us before, you know the deal by now. And you've always been in the comfort of your own homes or at the office maybe. But for us then, as the Cloud Debate team and our panelists, we are working slightly differently because we are not sitting in a room together. We are all behind our computers at home for the evening. But that doesn't change much because we will still channel your questions and we will get them on the live feed and we will try to answer as many of them as possible. And for some of you might know that the topic for this under discussion tonight is ethics and the fourth industrial revolution. And this is the first time we actually dig a little bit deeper into the idea of what happens with technology, for example, in terms of the medical science. What happens? What are the ethical issues that we need to consider when we think through some of these issues? There are a lot of things that can go wrong, as we know, with technology, and there are a lot of things that we need to be aware of when we interact with the technology, but also when we design technology, whether it's, as I say, then in the medical realm or in the banking world, finance world, and a lot of other aspects of the fourth industrial revolution and the lives that we lead. And with me tonight to answer some of these questions, I have a fantastic panel of colleagues. And firstly, two colleagues of mine here at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Basie von Solms, who is the director of the Center for Cybersecurity in the Academy for Computer Sciences here at the University of Johannesburg. So a warm welcome to you, Professor von Solms. It's absolutely lovely to have you with us tonight. And also with us, thank you. Also with us, we have another colleague of mine here at the university, Professor Chris Stein, who is in the department or Faculty of Medical Science, I should say, Health Sciences, and in the Emergency Medicine. A warm welcome to you as well, Professor Stein, and it's going to be interesting to hear what you have to say as well.
Thank you.
And last but not least, a former colleague of us here at the university who is currently in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Pretoria, Dr. Mpho Chiwase, who is in the Department of Philosophy, as I just said. A warm welcome to you as well, Mpho. It's absolutely lovely to have you back with us here at the university. And we are glad that you have, been able to tear yourself from the big university over there and come to the even bigger university over here. Virtually, of course. And Mpho, I would like to start off the discussion tonight by turning to you. As a doctor of philosophy, the ethical issues and philosophical questions that arises through the idea of interaction with technology and the idea of living the fourth industrial revolution. If you were to address some of the issues that you think we should be thinking through, what would those be?
Thank you for that, Ilva. Thank you for that question. I think it's so interesting to be living, especially in the COVID times at the moment, and to look at what exactly are we doing or how exactly are we relating with one another. And I think when we talk about ethics, whether it's AI or it's among, it's in medicine or technology and so forth, I think the basic question has to do with how or what principles we actually apply when we're relating to one another. Now, in philosophy, when we talk about ethics, most of the time historically, it's been a question that has to do with how humans interact with each other. And that has often been an issue of the value that persons have. And it obviously brings in the question of personhood. Who counts as a person? If you think of a lot of thinkers in philosophy actually root the answer to moral questions by looking at the value of persons. What counts as a person? Who is the person? What is the nature of a person? And that has been the trajectory of the discussion, is to talk about which group of people actually belongs to the ethical realm and which group doesn't. Traditionally, the question has often been about the value in comparison to of persons in comparison to animals. But now we have a new group of I don't know, agents to actually think about, and even to think about whether robots or artificial intelligent beings are agents is a very interesting question, because agency, in one sense, actually presupposes autonomy. So when I'm thinking about ethics in artificial intelligence in the fourth industrial revolution, part of what I'm thinking of is what are the principles that we ought to be thinking about and applying when humans are interacting with these technological gadgets. And I think that's a very difficult question, or an interesting question rather, to answer and ask, because part of it is when it comes to humans, there's a reciprocity that exists there, but we can't quite expect the same reciprocity with artificial agents. And these principles that we often think about when we're talking about ethics and morality often have to do with a level of respect. But humans and artificial agents can't quite think about values such as agency, autonomy, authenticity, and respect in the same way. The kind of autonomy that we think about, or the view of autonomy we have when we're talking about machines, is not quite the same when we're talking about humanity. So the question of ethics in the fourth industrial revolution brings about an issue, I think, about the principles that we ought to apply, but also the way in which we use the words. The words that we use when talking about ethics don't seem to mean exactly the same thing for artificial agents as it does for humans. And I think I'll leave it there for now.
I think that's really interesting, and I'm maybe sort of hardlining it a bit, or you know, it's sort of almost like man versus machine here, in a sense, you know. So what does it mean to be human, and where do we draw these lines between man and machine? And I'm actually going to turn to Professor pounce here, who is a professor of computer sciences. So I'm gonna let you represent it, sort of maybe wrongly, the machine side of things here. But in terms of the fourth industrial revolution, then, and ethics from a perspective of a computer scientist, Professor pounce, how would you frame this discussion?
Chair, thank you very much for asking me and giving my opinion. Yes, as you rightly said, I'm a computer scientist. I've been a computer scientist for basically the last 50 years. And I think we'll all agree that computers and information technology, hardware, software, etc., are maybe one of the most important aspects, technical aspects of the fourth industrial revolution, if not the most important. Therefore, if we accept that, then something like computer science and specifically programming becomes core to what is going to happen in the fourth industrial revolution and what's happening today. The concept of ethics in computer science is well established. It is actually being started off, and I want to use a very short example. I'd like to come back later this evening to some other aspects. But in the 1980s, one of the most eminent computer scientists in the world, a guy called Professor David Parnas, was asked by the then President Ronald Reagan of the US to join his so-called Star Wars or SDI program. Parnas did not accept it. He resigned the request to join the committee. And his reasoning was, and I think that brings us towards what I see as a big aspect of ethics in computer science. He basically said, and I'm just wording him, we must say to the public, to the president, and to everybody out there, it is just not possible to ensure that the computers that we are going to design, that must handle all these satellites and protect us, that these computers will always operate correctly. It is not possible to do that. and therefore I will not join this, because ethically he didn't really use that word, I think, but ethically he actually said, I can't associate myself with something which we can't properly test. And that, I think, and I'll come back to that later this evening, that is what I think is the core of what we're going to see and have to consider in the fourth industrial revolution. Mm-hmm. We can, through our programs, create increasingly, unbelievably complex and complicated systems. And even at this point of time, it is not possible to make sure that all those programs are correct, that they will always operate as they should operate. So what Parnas said in the 1980s is even more active, more relevant, and more actual today. And you'll see in the rest of my discussion, I will stand with that. I see Parnas as sort of a role model in terms of taking a stand against things. And I think we as computer scientists, people that are working in the area, should also start taking stands, making statements, and warning that many of the things that we can develop, maybe we should not think of developing, or we shouldn't go there. There are lots of experts, much, much more intelligent than I am, that has already started saying, creating treaties and documents warning against that, and people like Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk are part of that. So that's my viewpoint, and it will be, we can do things, but should we do things computer-wise?
Yeah. And that's actually a question that I wanted to come to, and this is how we framed the discussion here tonight as well, is exactly that. Should some technology be developed at all? And I remember as well, and I think that maybe before we go there, and I'm going to turn to Professor Stein here as well, but maybe just a quick sort of retort back to you, Professor Vassos, is that I remember as a teenager reading Asimov's I, Robot, for example, where the discussion was then that, yes, you can have all good intentions as a programmer to do something, but I think that what the fears that come up in the context of artificial intelligence is this idea that where do the line go? So when does this artificial intelligence become the artificial life on its own? And I think that's where people are fearful then, when the programmer, us, behind the technology, lose control over something. And I think that's where the fears come up. But we'll come back to some of those questions in our discussions here tonight. Because I'd like to turn to and introduce Professor Stein as well. You come from the medical sciences and emergency medicine. And of course, there are a lot of questions that come up in the realm of, with regards to medical technology and artificial intelligence. And I think that much of it is something that we actually then appreciate. Once we start thinking about medicine and medical science, we're often very appreciative of some of the technologies that will, assistive technologies, for example, if we have an impairment of sorts and so forth. But there are some ethical questions, I think, that arises as well. So I don't know how you would like, from your perspective and your own discipline, like to frame this discussion.
Thanks. Yeah, I think from a kind of a bioethics perspective, there are a number of really pertinent issues. But for me, I think possibly three of them would be the issue of trust, and I think that speaks to perhaps the ethical principle of justice. That artificial intelligence, for example, has to be transparent, and we have to understand exactly how it works, so that we don't end up with a situation where patients, obviously in a health context, experience bias and unfairness in terms of how they're treated. And I'm thinking of things like decision support systems, and some of the AI that's been used to analyze imaging, for example. I think this can get quite problematic, I mean, depending on what kind of AI you're talking about. Some of it is pretty straightforward and simple. If you're looking at something like decision trees, they're very straightforward and easy to understand. But I think if you're getting to the more esoteric and really powerful forms of AI, like deep learning, for example, it becomes difficult to often understand how a deep learning neural network has actually predicted the things that it has. And so if we can't fully understand that, and this AI seems to be doing things that might be biased, we can't do anything about it, and we can't really explain. So there are obvious ethical implications in that. And patient's perspective in healthcare, it might be a good thing. The other thing, the first one is the issue of autonomy. Patient's perspective, and that obviously relates to private, that comes up all the time in terms of AI and the analysis of big data in healthcare, that the data has to come from somewhere, and the data belongs to people. And so how do we address that whole issue of privacy and consent in actually using that data? So that seems to be quite an intractable problem. And perhaps we can come back to it a little bit later on and speak about it in more detail, because it's a common problem in healthcare, in fact. When dealing with patients who don't have the capacity to give consent, what do we do? Do we just say we're not going to utilize that data, even though it might have benefits, or is there another way that we can possibly look at this? So that's the second thing. And then the third thing is the whole issue of harm or non-maleficence as an ethical principle. And I think that can manifest in a number of different ways, but a very interesting one you've already mentioned, and that is the issue of superintelligence and this kind of runaway AI that we might not be able to switch off. And I think from a healthcare perspective, that has obvious risks. So that is a very interesting one. And I think in recent years has gained a lot more prominence. It started out being a kind of a crazy idea, like something from a bad movie. But it certainly gained a lot of prominence now, and it's very much in the foreground. And so we have to be very, very careful ethically what we dabble with and how we do this, so that we don't end up in a situation where a super intelligent agent refuses to let us to switch it off, to allow us to switch it off, to the disadvantage of everybody. So those are basically my three things.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. I mean, I think that what's interesting here, and I think that also comes a little bit back, maybe goes into the legal realm as well. I mean, we've had some discussions in previous cloud debates around, for example, self-driving cars and who is liable and so on. But I think when it comes then to an ethical responsibility in terms of robots doing surgery. You undergo surgery, but it's not a doctor in the room, but a robot, and someone else is directing that robot, for example, from afar and so on. And who is the ethical implications of it, and who's ultimately then responsible for ensuring ethical practices, for example. And I think those are some of the questions probably that we need to think through as well, and that people are interested in. And I'm sort of maybe simplifying it a bit, but still. And but we can come back to that. And I think that something that I wanted to pick up on is this idea of, you say, trust. Dr. Chiwase, trust. What is trust in terms of, from a philosophical and ethical perspective?
Wow, that's quite a loaded question, actually. When you're thinking of values such as trust, I mean, it's again the thing I said earlier about the way that humans think of words such as trust, and the way that they could develop a different meaning when we're talking about machines, brings this complexity in terms of humans then relating with machines based on human values that machines themselves may not actually quite understand, or the way that those values may not quite apply to machines as they do to humans. So if you're talking about trust, there's a level of faith that goes in there, you know, and I'm not sure that we can talk about machines operating on faith. I think that's quite a very human trait, or a very human value, which we cannot, it may actually be inconsistent with machine, the nature of machines to talk about trust. And it's a similar, I mean, when Christopher was talking about the problem of harm, is precisely this issue that comes into play, that when there's things like forgiveness that happen when humans are interacting with one another. But the thing is, it becomes a problem when we start expecting machines to then interact with humans on a human level. And I think there's something quite interesting that happens there, even when we're talking about ethics of AI or ethics of the fourth industrial revolution. What we're really talking about is humans responsibly creating machines that are not going to harm other humans. But the problem there is that we don't have, as Professor Bassi said, we don't have the control. We don't have complete control over what it is that these machines can do. What is their limit? How far could they go? And if they go astray, you know, what would that mean for humans? But again, even when we're talking about, so the point is, in relation to trust, what we are really trusting when we talk about the fourth industrial revolution or the ethics of AI is not the machines, but the people who are actually creating these machines. We want to trust that what they're doing, or they're sure of what they're doing, and then they're going to try and put things in place that will not harm human beings, because ethics is really about the prevention of harm. And in addition to preventing the harm, is holding the one who caused the harm responsible for that act. Yeah.
Professor von Solms, can we trust the computer scientists?
I think that's a very good question, and I think the discussion just now by the previous panelist was very interesting, in the sense that eventually, even today, the ethics of programming, if we can call it like that. I'm a pragmatist. I'm very impressed with all these things about humans and legal systems and medical systems. I'm not there. I'm a practical pragmatist in terms of programming is concerned. The fact is that, can you trust programmers? And that's where the ethical issue comes in. And my issue, my view, and I think we must accept that, is that the answer is no. The bad guys, cyber criminals, and remember, cybercrime is one of the biggest forms of crime in the world. They are using precisely the same technology that we are going to use to create all these benefits and wonderful machines for the fourth industrial revolution. And let's not be negative. We're going to get massive benefits from intelligent machines, etc., etc. But on the other hand, there's the downside, the dark side, where the cyber criminals, and that may not be syndicates, it may be nation states, where they go the other way and use the same technology that are coming to the fore in artificial intelligence, in machine learning, and all these things, use it for a different view. You know, it's interesting that somebody like Tim Berners-Lee, who was the father of the World Wide Web, just a year ago, he said, I created a monster. That was his words about the World Wide Web. Meaning that it is so misused, it's so bad, it's so used by the other side, the dark side. And that, I think, to come back to your question, can we trust programmers? Because eventually it will be programmers, at least in the beginning, that's going to program the systems until the robots are intelligent enough to program itself. Then we're lost, I think, because then we can't understand what they're programming. and we can't control the code. Even today, we are creating, as I said earlier, on software systems, which is so massive that it can never be tested. That's why maybe software science, software engineering is one of the disciplines where you market the product knowing right from the beginning there are flaws and vulnerabilities in there. And that's the point I'm trying to make. If we look at autonomous cars and all those, somebody must create those algorithms, must create the code. That person may be intelligent, they may do it. The bad guy might come in and plant malware in that well-designed system. And there are wonderful ways, shrewd ways to plant that malware. So you will lose control of that, although the guy who designed it for a good purpose. Maybe that's what Berners-Lee had in mind.
We're actually getting a question that talks to what you're just saying, and that is from Peter Richards, a member of our audience, who says, what frameworks exist to engender trust for the individuals who design the software for the programs used in AI?
Well, I don't know whether you're asking me, Chair, but I'm saying the people who design the software is everybody. Programming has become every man's thing. You know, if you go back to the first atom bomb and nuclear science, then the people that designed the atom bombs and nuclear systems, they were absolutely experts. Nobody else could actually do it except those very highly skilled guys. Programming today, computers today, the programming environment is becoming so easy that everybody can program a computer. And if you can't do it, you just go to the dark web and you buy the software, the bad software that you want. So, yes, that's why the core of the whole issue and I said that right at the beginning, the ethics in computer science is extremely important. About 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, 2003, we accredited our 4-year BSc degree with the British Computer Society, which is the chartered institute for IT in the United Kingdom. The first thing they asked us 20 years ago, do you have a course, a module in your degree course about ethics? We didn't have it. Now we've got it. We've got it 20 years already. So we're teaching our students to think ethical. But the cybercrime is growing. Many people don't go through formal courses. They've never exposed to such ethical courses in programming. They just start or they buy the code and they do the bad things.
No, thank you for that. And I think that there are a couple of questions that's coming through here, and we might come back to that particular question as well about safeguarding and the framework and who oversees certain processes and the development and so on. There's a question here from Janine DeWitt in the audience, and I'm going to channel that one to you, Professor Steyn. And Janine asks, what about bioengineering, a man-machine integration, she says. We are already integrating prosthetics. What do you say to that?
I think regardless of what the biomedical applications of computer technology might be, I think the principles remain the same. And those principles are about often in the health research space, which is mostly where I work. We talk about benefit and risk ratios, and so often I think you can apply a very similar approach by looking at the ethical principles of beneficence and non-maleficence, and just making sure that in whatever we do, and Prof. van Salms has pointed out sometimes how difficult this can be, but in whatever we do and however we apply technology, that there is always a positive benefit to risk ratio. So it's definitely easy to talk about it and not so easy to apply. But I think the principles remain the same, regardless of what you're doing, whether you're creating artificial intelligence to screen CT scans looking for breast cancer or whatever it is, prosthetics, decision support systems, expert systems. I think the ethical principles will always be the same.
do we need, and this is questions coming through from the audience here once again, do we need governance structures for this? And do we need maybe government interference, but overall sort of governance structures to oversee some of these processes and regulate them? And that's a question that I'm posing to all of you.
Yeah, I think I would say yes, it is necessary. I'm not sure exactly what is in place at the moment. One question that often arises with the theme of ethics is whether regulations or laws make something ethically acceptable. So people often ask if something is lawful, surely it's ethical. And the answer to that question is no, not necessarily. I think we could probably think of regulations and law as a kind of a minimum requirement. They're not always ethical, but the whole question of whether something is ethically acceptable kind of rises above a question of whether it's lawful or not. But certainly, I would say there should be regulation of this kind of thing. Yeah.
And this is a question that's coming up as well that sort of tags on to what we said, which I think is quite interesting. And Professor Vossholz, you've already mentioned this. You mentioned the dark web, and someone says, but the dark web is already bigger than the surface web, so to speak. Can we ever regulate it?
Well, yes, we talk about the surface web. That's the web that we can see. Then there's the deep web, which is the web that we can not access through our search engines, but is quite no problems there. It's just that they are controlled in terms of access. And then there's the dark web. And the dark web, as you say, is probably bigger and it's more dangerous. The fact is there's no way you can control the dark web because everything in the dark web is basically anonymous. You never know who you are talking to. You know never what you're talking to. And apparently you can do whatever you do, you can find there. So that is also the issue that I think all the panelists have referred to. The fact is that whatever you do to create something beneficial, and I think specifically Chris's area of the medical field, I've got no doubt about it, that the bad guys, and let's call them not cyber criminals, but call them the bad guys for the time being, they will get access to that code. They will change it to perform certain things which wasn't planned in the original code. And they will make it available for sale on the dark web. So you can go and buy it there. That's a fact. I think we must accept that we can't control that environment. And I think there was a question about can software ever be secure? Can we always trust software? No, we can't. That's precisely the point. We're creating such complex systems, and I've said it before, that there is no way in the world that we can ensure that what's happening in there is correct. We can test and test and test, but it's impossible to test it properly. So we market it. I think that's the problem also in all the types of advanced software that we're already getting and that we will get further on.
Yeah.
So I personally can't see how we're going to control this. We have to make some decisions from the beginning saying we're not venturing into that area. And we can have treaties and agreements and whatever it is about that. But then the other side can just say, oh, we're not worried about the treaties. You know, if you go to the back to the First World War, there was a treaty that gas cannot be an international treaty, cannot be used in warfare. And eventually, in the First World War, that was one of the biggest problems. People just didn't listen to that when they really get into that area. So I think the discussion is so important tonight, and we have to think wider. I think a lot of research, both from the areas of the other panelists, but specifically also from the software engineering side, must be done to build in some control measures, which I personally don't think at this point of time I know how it should be done.
Yeah, it's interesting because what I'm hearing is if we can't regulate, then it's left to trust, and we've already discussed that trust part is quite tricky. There's a question that's come up as well. There are lots of questions, there are lots of discussions going on in terms of from the audience. But I think that Weasley Dorsam has an interesting question being posed about bias. So. We know about human bias, so we can have biases in our programs, of course, we can, supposedly there can be a programmatic bias that comes from whomever is behind the software, for example. But what about, AI exhibiting bias? I don't know, from a philosopher's point of view, Dr. Chuasa, what would you say to that? Is there a bias, AI bias?
That's an interesting question, and thank you, Wesley. But I think, again, it's very difficult at a time where we have not confirmed machine learning that AI could be biased. I think when we talk about bias, in the same way I talked about trust, is we have to think about the person that's doing the programming. So is it a bias then that's coming to the fore using AI as an instrument for driving that bias? And I think there is a lot of that already, and we see it. I mean, you just have to go onto Facebook, and if you Googled something earlier or something, or whatever the case may be, you're immediately getting adverts on a particular product. And I think that is some form of bias. But that we could think of it as a harmless kind of bias. But there are more, There are more harmful kinds of bias, and biases that can actually prevent people from getting information or getting access to opportunities that they need. And I think those are the kinds of biases that we need to be careful of, and put regulations in place to make sure that when these programmers and software developers do their work, that they have these things in mind. Because a lot of what's wrong with our society is based on prejudices that are informed by some kind of bias.
No, thank you for that. I mean, there's a couple of questions that come up around bias as well, and a couple of questions here about human dignity, and particularly around collaborative. Eric says, with increased use of AI, human dignity, especially with collaborative robots, diminishes in workplaces. How can this be avoided? I don't know if the panelists have any thoughts on that.
If I could just say, often when we're talking about relations or in workplaces or anywhere in society, there's always some aspect of power that forms or informs that experience with the other. And I think here, as Professor von Solms said earlier, is that the power of artificial intelligence or these AI machines is that they have the ability to know more than we could ever imagine that a human being could. And we always say it in casual forms that information is power. So if we're working with these powerful machines, at what, how much of our dignity gets actually limited by the fact that we have less information, or we could at some point be weaker species because of our limited information or limited knowledge.
Thank you for that. I'm going to turn to you, Professor Stein. Two questions to you. The first one builds about the discussion that we were just having. Medical science, human dignity. I mean, these are big topics and important ones. And I think that how do we ensure human dignity in the space of the medical realm, for example? That's my first question. And there's a question that's come through, and I'm shifting the gear here a little bit from the audience as well, and that has to do with infotech and biotech, and when they become combined, what happens. But maybe we'll start with the first question around human dignity.
Thanks. Yeah, dignity as a concept, I think, has a very intuitive feel to it, but I think from a philosophical perspective, it can actually be quite a difficult thing to really get a handle on. I mean, it's been questioned whether dignity adds anything beyond autonomy as an ethical principle. And Ruth Macklin, for example, who's a philosopher, has argued that it really doesn't go beyond anything more than just autonomy and respect for autonomy. And whether it does or not, I don't really want to dwell on here, but a lot of the concerns in healthcare related to 4IR and to AI specifically, as I said earlier, come down to autonomy, come down to consent and the right to privacy. That is a huge issue. I think I mentioned earlier that I did want to come back to this. We face very similar problems in health research, where, for example, tissue is used for genetic research, just to use one example. And then some of the tissue is retained and it's kept, and that's called biobanking. And the question then arises about what we can actually use that tissue for at a future time. So a person has donated that tissue. It's been used for research that they've given their consent for, but maybe 5 years down the line, we think of another use for it in terms of research. What are the ethical issues, and should we and can we go ahead and do that research without their consent? Or alternatively, should we allow or entertain the prospect of people giving broad consent, which means I give you consent to do pretty much whatever you want with it. It's even been questioned whether that is in fact consent. Does it even fit the definition of being consent? So these are issues that are faced in health research, and I see the same things now relating often to AI, because often the most powerful forms of AI use very, very big data sets. So that expression, big data, and obviously that's got to come from somewhere. And the question of consent is very central to some of the issues around that, particularly in healthcare. So we've basically got two options. One option is to say that we must get consent from health users to use their personal private data for AI. And we put measures in place to get that consent, or we must say that we can't do the AI because we can't get their consent. And just to take an analogous debate from health research, people are asking questions now about why autonomy as an ethical principle seems to be right at the apex and right at the pinnacle of everything, and why other ethical principles don't come into the picture more. So, for example, in health research, if you can't get informed consent from somebody, there are all sorts of other things that can be sort of tried. But basically, if a person is incapacitated and you can't get consent from them, then pretty much the door is closed. You can't do the research. And certainly from a legal perspective, the National Health Act does not allow for any research to be done without informed consent. And so that's very limiting, and it ignores a lot of the benefits that can accrue from that kind of research in what we would, I suppose, call it the public good, in future. And so that's a hot debate in health research is should we be bringing the public good into the ethical debate more, and perhaps not de-emphasize autonomy, but just try and balance them a little bit more. And I think this is equally applicable to AI, because the issues around privacy and consent might, I think, require us to look at this a little bit differently if we're going to realize a lot of the good and a lot of the benefits that can come from some of these very powerful techniques, obviously assuming that they're done properly and with adequate trust. But it's just an interesting debate that is almost an evolution in terms of the way we're thinking about autonomy, and just questioning why it's the trump card, and why we're not considering a more of a communitarian type of public good argument for the use of this data.
I had promised we were also going to talk about this link between infotech and biotech, but I just want to throw something in, and maybe this is in between, talking to what you just said. And I think that this is maybe a question as well that Professor Rousseau can answer as a computer scientist. Who do we give consent to as well? Because if you and I can have an agreement as human to human that, I'm giving you consent, or your organization consent. But often when we talk about new technology, for example, and this idea of giving their consent, where you might not be aware that you're giving consent to a third party to harvest certain data about you, for example. And we've seen that around, certain scandals of late and so on. But also, if we have bots that are collecting information, do we know who we're giving away consent to, for example? I don't know if Professor Solz, you want to channel that question.
Yes, I've got quite a couple of issues, but I won't take too much of your time, Chair, because we haven't got much left. I just want to say something about this concept of bias in programming. Programmers are creating algorithms, and algorithms can be biased, of course, because the guy who created the algorithm built in his personal bias. There's no right or wrong way as such. Yeah. So let's take it a little bit further. We're talking about autonomous vehicles. We're getting more and more towards getting autonomous vehicles. That vehicle is run by a program, run by algorithms, making decisions on behalf of whoever. That car must decide at a certain point of time, according to the algorithm that is given to him, should I turn left and kill a pedestrian, or should I turn right and run head on into a big lorry? Those are the type of things that we're going to give to autonomous vehicles. Now, take that one step further, and I think that is one of the core, and again, I'm talking as a technical guy. I really can't really add to the discussion about the psychological and philosophical, etc. areas. But let's talk about autonomous weapon systems, where a drone without any human intervention is programmed to kill a human. Without a human intervention, he programs says, go out, look for these things around, and then fire this missile. At the moment, we're not yet there. We do fire missiles from remote vehicles, but there's still a human involved. That's why there's a big development against the whole concept of autonomous weapon systems. But again, that's driven by algorithms. And now if we start going into the whole machine learning area, then maybe I've built in some bias into my algorithm for something. Now this algorithm can be self-learning. As he gathers more information, he can decide, well, this is maybe a better approach, or this is a better avenue to do it. Then he can change without me, who created it initially, is aware of that. And that is the type of, I think, things we must realize. Yeah. Just another very much more pragmatic matter that worries me a lot. Yeah. And Professor Steiner will probably can come in on that, is the whole aspect of 5G. 5G is a core technology, communication technology within the fourth industrial revolution. Nobody is yet sure whether 5G is going to cause serious medical, human, mental problems. We don't know. We're going to roll out 5G systems because we need the speed for all these new fourth generation systems. But we're not sure whether it's going to impact on the human. That may take another 100 years. It took us hundreds of years to determine that smoking is bad for health. How are we going to find out about these technologies health-wise? So I'm sorry, I haven't got any solutions. I'm really worried. And all I can say is, I think the public out there must realize that we're going to create systems. We're going to expose to systems that nobody really knows whether they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, and they will keep doing what they're supposed to do. By that, we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater. We must get the beneficial from fourth industrial revolutions, but we must do research to ensure that somewhere we draw a line.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And I think that it's interesting because I think that we also, maybe we need a separate actually cloud debate to talk about this, how does this impact our health? And I think that's a really interesting question. We are running out of time, but I think that I'm going to try to link the two questions together, because my last question to all of you as panelists will be about, should certain technology technologies not be developed at all? And I think that's a really interesting and really, really important question here. But before we go there, and you can take this question as well, Professor Stein, but I want to go back just quickly, because the question has been raised: what are the major risks with the integration of infotech and biotech? And maybe link that also then to if certain technologies maybe should not be developed at all.
I think, infotech and biotech as terms are very broad. It ranges from relatively simple technologies through to AI. I think the focus of this evening is more along the lines of things like artificial intelligence. And the really key thing about that as a technology, as Prof. van Solms has said, is that artificial intelligence is exactly that. It learns continuously. And at the moment, we are relatively safe. I say relatively, because the AI that we have is what's often referred to as a one-trick pony. It's a very specific AI that's aimed at a very specific thing. So it's something, I gave the example earlier on, it's AI that screens CT scans and looks for signs of breast cancer, for example. Or if you want to go out of the healthcare domain, there's AI that beats world champion chess players. And there was AlphaGo, that beat the world champion Go player. So, but they do one thing. They just do a single thing. They do it extremely well. They do it better than the best person in the world. But they can't paint a picture, and they can't hold an intelligent conversation with somebody. So those things are relatively safe because they're just confined to one thing. I think the risky thing is when we start getting what's often referred to as general intelligence or artificial general intelligence, which then has the ability to really shut us out, because it can look at itself and improve itself and run away with that process to the point that we can't switch it off. So I really, the AI that's around at the moment, I can't really see that happening, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I've missed something, but I don't see it happening with that. The big issue is superintelligence, and that goes beyond the healthcare domain. That goes beyond any single domain. That is an intelligence which really can affect everything and can prevent us from intervening for the purposes of safety. So that to me is the big risk. I think that's pretty much where the focus is this evening, rather than on sort of lesser technologies which we can control. Things that are not AI related, we have a lot more control over.
Yeah. No, thank you. And I'm going to ask the same question to the other panelists as well. Are there certain technologies that should not be developed? And I'm going to give Dr. Chiwasa the last word. So maybe just a quick word from you first on the question, Professor van Solms, and then we go to the lady.
Well, yes, I've reiterated the point already. I think really there are limits where we should be going. Because humankind can develop anything. Software can do anything eventually, and create applications which can do anything. And I think we should seriously consider where we should be going. What should we do? But again, saying we must do it, it's a problem, because if we decide we're not going to do it, then the other side may decide they're going to do it anyway. And so we're back to square one.
No, thank you for that. And Dr. Chiwasa, you get the final say. The final say. Well, it won't be the final say, but is that technology that you think should not be developed? Is that maybe?
I think I do agree with Professor van Solms that there are certain technologies that should not be created or developed. When we're talking about human dignity, really, when we're talking about ethics, we're talking about ways to protect human dignity. So if there are technologies that can be developed that will immediately threaten human dignity or limit human dignity, then I think then there's cause for us to pause and think about whether that technology is necessary and should actually be created. And I think there's a lot already that makes us doubt whether the existing technologies are actually geared towards protecting the human dignity. I mean, humans have a sort of intrinsic value around which all our ethical norms, all of our legal laws and so forth are created precisely to protect. So we either let people develop what they want to develop without limits, or we create more norms and legal laws that are actually going to guard against, you know, the vulnerability that humans have in relation to machines.
No, thank you for that. I guess the big question still remains then, you know, can we and do we can we sort of protect ourselves, and can we build in these checks and balances to not see this kind of runaway technology then where we lose control and then and we don't have control over the technology anymore. And I think that's the big question, and maybe we can come back to that as well in a different discussion. I think it's been very, very interesting listening to you, and it's been different perspectives. And I think that it's also interesting to see, because often when we come out from our different disciplines and our different vantage points and our own research and so on, there can be disagreement. But I think there's been a lot of agreement between you that there are issues that we need to think through, and there are certain things that we shouldn't entertain because we don't know what they mean and the implications of certain technologies, for example, from an ethical perspective. So thank you very, very much. It's been fantastically interesting listening to you all. And I am so grateful that you have taken time out. And at least you didn't have to travel that far to join the debate tonight. And I'm grateful for that. And I hope that you will come back and join the panel again, or tune in as audience as well. And our next cloud debate is going to focus on communications and the role of communications in 4IR, and that's going to be interesting. And of course, that's something that's very close to my heart as coming out of the field and discipline of communication. So I'm hoping that you will all tune in then, and that you will listen to us and join us. And I think that we are facing many challenges and a whole new world that the pandemic as well, the COVID-19 pandemic, has brought upon us. And I do think that there are a lot of these issues that comes up in the realm of the medical science, that of course is, you know, finding vaccines and so on, but also how we then start interacting in a post-COVID world. And there are a lot of new things that we've had to learn and get used to during the last couple of months as well, globally, not only in a South African or local context, but globally. So it has implications for how we interact as humans, as you said, you began there. Of course, I think that's really, really interesting. So thank you very, very much. And thank you to all of those who joined us at home as well. And I'm so grateful for all your questions. And I realized that we haven't been able to channel them all. And I'm hoping, as I said, if we can return to some of these discussions. And I say that each time when we wrap up our cloud debates, that we're going to return to this. We need to create time, and we need to have many more of these discussions. And I'm hoping that we can do this throughout this year as well. So God bless, stay safe, wear your mask, wash your hands, look after each other, and be mindful of taking time to spend with your families during this period as well, and to keep each other safe and healthy. Thank you very much, and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you, Ilse.
Thank you for your professional chairmanship.
Chairwomanship.
Indeed.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think it's been really interesting, and I hope that the audience as such will tune in again, and that you will all find time to join us again, because I think that these are very, very important discussions. And if we don't tackle these issues now, we might find ourselves in troubled waters down the line. And I think that's something that's been pointed out again and again by you as our panelists, but also then channeling some of the questions that have come through from the audience. And I know that this is being recorded, and for the audience that's still with us online, and for you as well, I think that this is some of the most important questions that comes up will also be saved, and come up in discussions. And hopefully when we the YouTube clip is something that people can go back to and hopefully channel questions either directly to you as panelists or back to us as the Cloud Debate team, and to see what we can then also channel back to you and get some clarification to from the audiences. I think that's very, very, very good.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.